Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Kamensky, the director of the Schlesinger Library, and I'm so pleased and even a little bit proud to welcome you to this opening event for the Age of Roe, now on exhibit in our Leah and William Pourvu Gallery. This exhibition and the linked conference that will take place in January have been nearly 2.5 years in planning. Schlesinger Library and our Radcliffe Institute colleagues undertook that work because we knew that the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade in January 2023 offered an opportunity to explore matters of deep significance, whatever jurists and lawmakers enacted in the space by the time that date rolled around. If you have a chance to visit the exhibition or attend the conference, you'll see that a hallmark of our planning has been evidence-based, curiosity-driven analysis from the wide range of disciplines and perspectives represented in Schlesinger Library's world-class and growing collections on pregnancy, parenthood, and the battle over abortion. The conversation you'll hear today reflects that approach as well. We're fortunate to have with us as our moderator this afternoon, Professor Mary Ziegler, Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis, and perhaps the world's leading expert on the world that made Roe and the world that Roe made. Professor Ziegler, who acted as guest curator for the exhibition and as co-planner of the conference, is the author of 5 books on the subject, with a 6th planned for release next year. She appears frequently in the opinion pages of the country's major dailies. Don't ask me how she does it, I can't answer. In addition to introducing her, I want now to thank her for the countless, literally countless hours she has spent with our staff and with our materials in preparation for these events. Let me also extend a public thanks to the Schlesinger staff members who have offered vital, necessary, and extensive support and expertise along the way. Curator Jenny Gottwals and archivist Laura Paymer. Professor Ziegler will engage in a wide-ranging dialogue with 2 intellectuals who come at the subject before us by asking different kinds of questions and who answer them via different theories and methods. Professor Kimberly Mutcherson, who is co-dean of Rutgers University Law School, is an eminent scholar of reproductive justice whose work has focused on assisted reproduction, abortion, disability, and medical decision-making for pregnant women and children. She is the author of a truly staggering number of field-defining articles, the editor of Feminist Judgments, published in 2020, a vital resource on gender, reproduction, and the law, and is working on what sounds like a fascinating new book on assisted reproductive justice. Joining Mutcherson in conversation is Dr. Andrew P. Lewis, professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. Lewis's work explores the intersection of politics, religion, and law in the United States, with particular interest in church-state relations, in conservative legal activism, and in rights politics. His award-winning 2017 book, The Right's Turn in Conservative Christian Politics, How Abortion Transformed the Culture Wars, is widely cited by journalists as well as scholars. I want to offer one last characterization of Lewis, Mutcherson, and Ziegler. All 3 of them have shown throughout their careers remarkable grace and fortitude engaging in dialogue across difference. We live in an age of absolutes, and these are rare intellectuals of both conviction and compassion. I'm so grateful to each of them for their work on the page and in the world, and for sharing their afternoon with us today. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to Professor Mary Ziegler.
Thank you, Jane. Excuse me. So as you can tell, I'm sick, so I will do my best not to lose my voice. But if I'm sneezing or coughing, that's what's going on. So I was delighted when Jane and everyone else at Radcliffe asked me to curate this exhibit on what the Age of Roe meant. And that, of course, required me to define what Roe is. And I think, of course, in the past 50 years or so, and even in the days since the Dobbs decision, we've learned that Roe is much more than a single Supreme Court decision. Americans, often Americans whose voices we've forgotten, have infused Roe with meanings well beyond anything the Supreme Court said in 1973 or in 2022. And so the spirit of the exhibit from its inception, and I think really even after Dobbs, has been one of encounter, right? I found in exploring some of the items that Schlesinger's collected, myself surprised by some things that I thought I wouldn't see or wouldn't react to had I expected to see them. These included, so they're obviously familiar items, right? We've all become accustomed to seeing arguments about rights and choice, or life and fetal rights, even arguments about the reality of abortion in America. But I found myself often encountering voices I hadn't heard or that I found surprising. Even in the space of politics, which I think has dominated so much of conversation about abortion and reproduction writ large, I found party alignments that we're no longer accustomed to. The voices of pro-choice Republicans, pro-life Democrats, or people who found themselves to be politically unidentifiable. I found kind of problematic and challenging questions about what Roe's roots were and what to make of the complicated early history of reproduction involving anything from contraception to sterilization to a right to procreate. I thought as well of the kinds of questions we can probe when we look at the messy voices of people involved in conversations about religion and race when it comes to abortion and reproduction. What we learn, for example, about progressive religious voices that are often silenced, or the complex origin stories of conservative Christian objections to abortion that have now come to seem politically inevitable. Of course, some of these conversations are conversations having nothing to do with politics. And those I think that are some of the most powerful in the exhibit, which I hope you can view in person, are those of people who've experienced abortion or performed it. I, for example, had never encountered some of the instruments used to perform abortions and realized that our attitudes toward them might be almost a sort of Rorschach test about what we make of the Age of Roe. The same, of course, goes for our visions of justice, whether justice was something that was done in the Age of Roe, our visions of who carries out justice and who should, and of course, our visions of what justice should mean going forward in an era where arguably Roe is gone. I'm hoping that Professors Mutcherson and Lewis can help me answer the question of whether the Age of Roe has even ended to begin with. I'm a little suspicious, in part because Roe has become such a central part of our cultural vocabulary and political framework that I'm not sure the Dobbs decision could put an end to it. So in that sense, obviously Dobbs transformed our planning, but in other ways it didn't. The question I think that the exhibit asks is, does anything change for you when you hear the voices of people who had abortions or sought them out? Does anything change for you when you see the inside of an abortion clinic or the people who worked in it? Does anything change for you when you see that the history of this struggle that's affected so many of us so deeply doesn't match your expectations? And I have no answers for these questions. As a historian, it's not my job to answer them. It's simply my job to ask. So I'm going to stop talking now and revert to the role I'm here mostly to play, which is not to cough and sneeze, but to ask questions. So I'm going to pose my first question to Kim, or Professor Mutcherson, as I should say, Dean Mutcherson. So Dean Mutcherson, the exhibit tells the story, or at least tells part of the story of the Age of Roe. That's what we've called it. So taking stock of that era, the past 50 years or so, what stands out to you when it comes to the history of movements, either for reproductive rights or reproductive justice, understanding that those have been very separate?
Yeah. So first of all, I am just absolutely delighted to be here, and I want to thank Jane for that really lovely introduction of us and of the exhibit. And of course, I always love to be in conversation with you. And I'm going to call you Mary because I promise I will forget to call you Professor Ziegler. So please, please, please just call me Kim. We all know each other, so that's okay. So, for me, I think what really stands out, from 1973 until where we are now, is the start of the reproductive justice movement, or at least of defining a certain way of doing this work as reproductive justice as opposed to reproductive rights. And I think Roe put us in a position where that kind of articulation of a different movement had to happen. So for those who are listening and who don't know the distinction that should be drawn and is drawn between reproductive justice and reproductive rights, just a very quick little history. So reproductive justice is a movement that was started by Black women in about 1994. And these were women who were activists in their communities, who had been doing amazing kinds of work across a very, very wide spectrum, and who felt really frustrated with the mainstream reproductive rights movement, a movement that was largely led by white women, and often white women who had significant class privilege. And so, this whole range of issues that were important to Black women, particularly Black women in the South, just weren't resonating for the mainstream reproductive rights organizations. And so reproductive justice is this much more expansive and fulsome way of thinking about the world. And it has three tenets, right? One is the human right to decide if you want to have a child. The second is the human right to decide if you don't want to have a child and have the tools to not have a child. And the third, and this is the prong that I think is particularly important for communities of color, for Black communities, for low-income communities, to be able to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. So what's so powerful about the reproductive justice movement, which again, I think, was born in the crucible of what came after Roe, is that it really pushes us to recognize that these decisions about, procreation and about getting pregnant or terminating a pregnancy are just a small slice of the reproductive lives that all of us live. And so we're making decisions about being parents, we're making decisions about what happens to our kids, we're making decisions about what our communities are going to look like. And that, for me, is probably the most important thing that has come out of the Age of Roe.
So, and I'll go ahead and call you Andy too, because I agree with Kim that it's not being well and wanting to call you Andy and Kim, it's going to happen. So I'll ask you a version of the same question, right? So you're an expert on histories of conservatism and Christian conservatism, the religious right generally. So what stands out to you during the Age of Roe about the trajectory of the pro-life movement?
Yeah, first I should echo Kim's comments, right? I think the introduction was lovely, and I'm really looking forward to a thoughtful conversation. I think what stands out to me is just like how in the world did this happen in some sense, right? Like you have this issue that deals with abortion rights and access, and what turns into sort of the pro-life movement on the conservative side. And how does that develop? How does it sort of become such a mainstay in a political party, which sort of tries to bring together a whole bunch of different interests? How does a group of religious advocates that were in tension with each other over a whole host of issues in the middle of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s come together to sort of coalesce around not only their position on abortion, but how they might pursue it, right? How are they able to gain access, especially to bring sort of what you might think of some of this populist flavor to a political party, and where they were first sort of outsiders of such a political party. And then the same thing happened with what you might call the conservative legal movement, being sort of, sometimes I call them junior partners in that movement, but then to become such a central force, right? And so I think some of those things are quite interesting. I think there's lots of discussions about how certain issues can coalesce or paper over differences in certain ways, and then they change the meanings of group alliances. And so I think we see a good bit of that happening in the politics of abortion over time. And then I think also the language, right? The way this is constructed and framed, and we may get into this more a bit later, but I mean, I think Professor Ziegler or Mary is right that we infuse meaning, or we construct meaning into court cases, and particularly this court case, Roe, I would say. And so that didn't just happen, right, in 1973 or 1974, and it took a long time to construct and infuse the language and the advocacy approaches. And I think we probably will get some reconstructing that's currently happening and will happen in the future. And so I find those things quite interesting and important, because I think they lay the groundwork for how we've gotten here, and maybe where we're going, and the tensions of what might be happening among some of the various political coalitions. And so that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about and reading and writing about. But those sort of connections of, like, especially because in the middle of the 20th century, you had a sort of a mishmash of, somewhat liberal Democrats and some, Catholic leaders, and then some fundamentalist Republicans that were sort of pushing this anti-abortion issue, but outside of the main boundaries of political party work. And then that all has changed. And so I'm quite interested in that. I think it's really one of the important trajectories of this discussion.
So my next question's for both of you. This was the question I kind of previewed. Do you think the Age of Roe is ended, right? And in what ways has it, and in what ways has it not, right? So what in the era of Dobbs do you think has carried forward? What do you think has changed? I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And I guess, Kim, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I want to go back to what Andy said, which was quoting what you said in the beginning, Mary, which is the ways in which people have infused so much meaning into Roe. And because they have infused so much meaning into Roe, frankly, a lot of people who probably never actually read the case and who didn't recognize how, certainly from a reproductive justice perspective, but even frankly from a reproductive rights perspective, Roe was problematic, right? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons to think we could have done a better job when Roe was decided. So, but because it has become such a rallying cry, right, and it sort of stands for this idea of what it means to be a woman who is treated as an equal citizen in this country. I don't think Roe's going away anytime soon. I think that people will continue to refer to it as this important and watershed moment, and that the overruling of Roe and Casey was and will continue to be this moment of extreme shock for a lot of people. And for some of us, the end of a very long and calculating road to get here. So Roe is with us, and I think Roe will continue to be with us for a long time to come, frankly.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because, and I was trying to stop back and step back and think, like, what other kinds of cases, right? Do we as an American public have so much understanding in the way it affects our politics, right? That people even know the names of, right, the case names of, and the some of the main parties, and I don't think there are very many, right, that fit with how you think about Roe. But it has come to mean a whole bunch of things, and I think in the age after the release of the decision, it meant a whole bunch of things. And so for people on the right, especially conservative Christians, had to do with things about the overstepping of the Supreme Court, right? And then family values and the Equal Rights Amendment and feminism and the reduction of religion in the public square, right? And so it came to mean a whole host of these sorts of things. And my assumption is that the Dobbs decision will come to mean a whole host of other types of things, and maybe almost exactly in the reverse in some ways, right? Like I can think that you will see people attach the rise of conservatives, especially religious conservatives in the legal sphere, especially in the Supreme Court and other parts of federal courts, as being part of the sort of the demise of Roe, right? That would be part of it. That you have this sort of rise of the sort of Christian right attachment to the Republican Party, that you have sort of this increasing focus on sort of the loss of rights. And so, I think you'll see a lot of those kinds of things. You still see people framing this issue in sort of the protecting or the legislating around Roe. And so my guess is that this is going to evolve in new ways, and probably the speed to which we generate meaning will happen faster in this period than it had since any period since probably the mid to late 1970s. And so I don't think we'll get away from Roe as being part of our sort of analytical framework or our political, touch point, right? But I think it will start to mean new, and we have new eras that you have to remember, like, we're all getting older somehow, right? Like, so people who are experiencing Roe in a very different way today than they would have experienced it, in the 1980s. And so I don't by any means think that it is over. And, I think no matter what, it's going to have to be contested for a bit. But I also think that we will continue to sort of ascribe meaning and value and understanding of what we want out of these sorts of discussions to that case now 50 years ago almost.
So, Kim, one of the key themes in the exhibit deals with how the complex politics of race and racial justice have intersected with battles about abortion access. And obviously you're expert on a lot of things, but that's one of the things that you have a lot of knowledge about. And so I was going to ask what you think viewers of the exhibit should know about this history when it comes to engaging with the materials in the exhibit, or these questions about racial justice and abortion. And relatedly, if you had thoughts on what was changing for people of color as the age of Roe comes to a close, as far as their reproductive lives are concerned.
Yeah. So I'll try to kind of mash those two together. So, one of the things that we sort of constantly say about the era before Roe, the era during Roe, and now I think the era after Dobbs, is that there are always going to be people who are able to get around restrictions, right? So whether it is somebody who can drive to another state, fly to another country, right, whatever it is to get access to the care that they want. And a huge part of our conversation about abortion access in this country has been about how difficult, even before Dobbs, how difficult it was for lots of women in this country to access abortion care. Black women are overrepresented in the number of women who have abortions in this country, which of course has then been used as a way to try to sort of drive a wedge into communities and talking about abortion as, a form of eugenics. You, of course, Mary, will remember the billboard campaign done by some anti-choice folks that basically said, the most dangerous place for a Black child is in its mother's womb. And so really buying into these, what I would say are incredibly dangerous and problematic stereotypes about Black women and agency and the kinds of decision-making that we engage in. So, one of the things that we're already seeing post-Dobbs, we've dozens and dozens of clinics have closed. I think something like over 60 clinics in about 15 states already have closed, and more will close. And so what that means, again, is the most vulnerable women are the women who are at risk. The other piece of this that I think is really critical is that we are likely moving into an era where we're going to see more criminalization of activities during pregnancy, criminalization of people self-managing abortions. And one thing that is very clear from the history in this country is that when we start criminalizing pregnancy and we start criminalizing people who make decisions during pregnancy that someone else thinks are problematic, that again, the people who get targeted for those types of interventions tend to be women of color, particularly Black women and poor women. So as I'm thinking about what's coming down the pike, I'm also thinking about the collateral consequences of that kind of criminalization. So if you get arrested, right, and we know that about 60% of people who have abortions already have children at home, if you get arrested or jailed or convicted for self-managing an abortion, what happens to your kids, right? Do your kids end up in a child welfare system that already disproportionately is full of Black and brown children, what happens to those communities, what happens to those women when they can no longer get access to, say, public housing. So there's just such a cascade of consequences here, and consequences that fall harder on some communities than they do on others.
Thank you. So Andy, the exhibit also treats themes related to the complex role played by religion during the Age of Roe. So I was going to ask if you could tell me what some of the most important contributions that you've seen during the Age of Roe that shaped that era, and if you've seen significant changes to conversations around faith and reproduction in the months since Dobbs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had to move slightly. The sun is coming in. We're glad to have the sun still at this late stage in the calendar in Cincinnati. But yeah, I think the religious conversations are really important to understand. I think a lot of people have, that's a common theme in the way that we discuss these things. One of the things I think that happened in the Age of Roe, and that I would guess, it was starting to happen in the late 60s, and I think really escalated to the late 70s and most of the 80s, is sort of this this coalescing, I would say, among what you might call the conservative Christian movements, but and becoming in some sense more conservative. But what you had sort of a fracturing of some of these religious groups. They didn't sort of work well together, and a lot of those were due to some of the fundamentalist tendencies of American Protestantism, especially Southern evangelicalism in the middle of the 20th century, and the sort of differences between Catholics and Protestants, and especially evangelical Protestants. You had some of this anti-abortion movement happening in the North, and then you sort of bringing in these Southern elements, and what happens is, over, I would say, a couple decades, some of those questions, it seemed like they got worked out, that they became sort of they became allies, and the abortion movement the anti-abortion movement sort of brought a lot of those groups together to sort of be aligned on this issue, and then a host of other political issues seemed to fall in place. One of the parts of that alignment was how is this discussed? What is the public arguments to oppose abortion? And one of the things I explore in my book, which Jane referenced earlier, is this language of rights, and sort of that comes out of the pro-life movement, and the right to life, and the rights of the unborn, and then that gets sort of paired with views about free speech, rights to free speech, and rights to religious liberty. And so this sort of tapping into these broader political themes, right, rather than pursuing what you might call sort of dogmatic separate religious arguments, right, but sort of bringing them together under this sort of umbrella that allows broader political coalitions, can fit well into a political party. I think that was one of the big movements that happened, and you start, you get some players involved, but it's sometimes overcoming the middle of the 20th century divisions, and sort of the fundamentalist divisions, the Protestant Catholic divisions. Like those were, I think, a big part that allowed the success of some of these movements. But in some sense, now I think we're revisiting some of those same divisions in the sort of post-Dobbs landscape. There are these real questions about some of like the sort of the fundamentalist Christianity things being rising to the fore. Questions about absolutism or incrementalism, right? And how should you approach who should be punished, right? What should the punishments look like? What should exceptions be? And a lot of those things got sort of hidden under the rug when you got to just push back against Roe, and now you have to come to state level decisions, right? And so you're sort of dealing with those kind of things. I think there's also this sort of populist element that's on the rise, and some of the established groups that have put a lot of built a lot of credibility, I would say, on some organizations, and have a lot of infrastructure, are being sort of sidelined for some more insurgent or sort of up and coming groups who have visions about what the future of abortion and abortion access looks like in America, and that those are leading to real tensions. And so I think those tensions are only beginning to arise. on the right. And I know Mary's written about this in some other places, but I think they're only beginning to rise. I think we're waiting to. I think it's in part they're caught up in the current political moment, and we will see how long that lasts and where it's going. But I think this sort of fracturing of a coalition which had been fairly unified is going to be one of the next phases of the sort of post-Dobbs era. And so what will that look like? And now that's in a landscape in which religion is declining, and religion among these groups is declining, right? And so what does that mean going forward? There are really a lot of really interesting questions that we should uncover, but that's, I think, at least a bit of the headline of some of what has happened and maybe what might be potentially percolating.
Great. So as many of you know, we're really close to an important midterm election. We're hearing a lot about whether abortion will be a major issue for voters, whether it will change the composition of Congress or the course of an election. So obviously shifting party politics was an important part of the Age of Roe. And I'm curious if you have each of you have thoughts on what was the most striking about party politics of abortion in this era, and if you predict or are seeing any changes as it potentially comes to a close.
So one of the things that I am not a political scientist. Let me just start with that. But one of the things that I have found really interesting is trying to think about how, if you were, for instance, a voter who normally votes Republican or who's on the right, and you were kind of a single issue voter, right? You could vote on abortion because you wanted Roe to be gone, and as long as you had a candidate who was anti-choice, that was a person who could get your vote. Whereas I think on the left, it has been a little more diffuse, the issues that people are concerned with and thinking about when they go into the voting booth. So I'm really curious to see what it looks like, right? Whether we see a bit of a shift where folks who sort of felt like, well, we have Roe, so I don't have to worry about that when I go into the ballot box, will think a little differently when they're voting this year. And you can sort of feel this sort of excitement, I think, right? So you have people reporting, oh, so many more women are registering to vote, and that must mean that they're going to vote in a particular way because of Roe. And I'm just not convinced that that is actually true. So yes, I think it's definitely on the ballot, and certainly in states where there are actually ballot measures related to abortion, that's going to be really important. But I'm not sure what exactly we're going to see coming out of these midterms. And frankly, I'm a little nervous.
No matter what happens, there are going to be a lot of think pieces about, how abortion played out, and I think that abortion politics played out, and I think those will probably be a bit premature. In many ways, some people think I'm a political scientist, but that might be debated by others. But anyway, I would say that I always think mobilization is really one of the key stories that we should think about, right? We get this public opinion data, and I'm in that world a bit, especially when it comes to sort of public opinion on abortion attitudes, and it can be complicated to parse some of those things out. But really, I think when you do that, you're missing this sort of story of mobilization. And for a long time, there was probably more mobilization on the right, sort of to push to get it sort of to be what you might think of sort of attacking a court decision they did not like. And then there was on the left. It's harder in some sense to defend some version of status quo, right, than it is to mobilize towards something. And now you have that environment pretty much flipped. And so it seems that, and this started not in May and June, but it started a year or two ago, is that you started seeing, and with the stuff happening out of Texas and other places, that you started seeing the mobilization factor that flip a bit to the Democratic Party. And so that is certainly changing. I mean, one of the big things that the anti-abortion movement was able to do was able to sort of infuse Republican politics with their sort of grassroots activism and volunteer and people knocking on doors and showing up for state party committees and electing people to those key positions and being involved in platforms. And it was all that kind of advocacy that made them a central player in the Republican Party when they didn't want them to be central players, 3 decades ago. And so some of that is changing. At the same time, I get the skepticism, right? I mean, I think for a lot of people, their abortion views have been sort of lower order political issues for a long time. A lot of people have made their peace with how their party identity and their abortion preferences fit together. And there are a whole bunch of other issues, and inflation, and world events, and the economy, and I don't know, lots of immigration and stuff that are going to matter a bit. I think it's likely that Republicans might underperform a bit due to that, and in certain places particularly. The Republican Party has been softening its hold on suburban people and suburban women especially, and so my guess is that some of that will continue. But it's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard to isolate one midterm election and the effects, right? Because especially it's like, oh, well, Republican candidate in this state won by only 4% when they could have won by 6%. Like, that's going to make for a really hard analysis for us as we go forward. So all that means is I think going forward, it does change the political dynamic some, but I think it's to be determined how much. And so that's one of these things that we're going to have to keep on the lookout for.
Great. Great. So I think we only have one more time for one more leading question from me. So one of the things I think the exhibit asks viewers to do is to encounter people who've actually had experiences with abortion, listen to their letters, see the spaces where abortions take place, see the tools that are even used in abortions. And a lot of these stories are pretty messy and personal, but we hear them less often, which is why I think in the exhibit, we wanted to present them. So I wanted to ask you as a kind of lightning round, what are the stories you wish were told more often in our conversations about abortion and about the Age of Roe?
I definitely wish that the voices of not just abortion providers, but also folks who are, running clinics were heard a lot more. I think that what's often missing from the discussion is that these are folks who are deeply committed to women and women's equality and ensuring that folks have access to the care that they deserve, and that they get to make decisions about what their families look like and get to make parenting decisions about how big their family is going to be, particularly in a country where our social safety net is incredibly porous. So, all of the abortion providers who I've met, or the people who, run clinics, are people who are deeply sympathetic in a lot of ways. And I think because we live in a world of so much abortion stigma, and a world, frankly, where they're at risk, for physical violence, that they often are sort of, hiding. And I think that that's a real loss for the whole conversation, frankly.
I think there's a lot of people on what we might call a liminal space, of these sort of on the edge kind of spaces that due to what I just said before, that sort of mobilization and the way our politics are structured, that there are a lot of people there that we don't hear those voices. And so, I mean, if you look at public opinion data, a lot of people, I think it might be best summarized that most people in America wanted Roe v. Wade to stay, but they thought it should have there should be maybe space for more restrictions than what was maybe legally allowed. But we don't hear those kinds of voices, right? This sort of in between, and sometimes we think of this as sort of some black and white issue, but a lot of people have views that are varied and that are somewhere in these sort of middle ground spaces, and they think differently. They have these different kind of conversations with their friends and their children, and their family and their spouses. And so our politics don't often allow those conversations. We have a lot of people who are on the ground running various social services things on both sides of this issue that we don't hear from, right? We hear from politicians, we hear from people filing court briefs. And so, I think there are a lot of people like that. And I think, so there's a lot to be heard. And I'm glad that an exhibit like this is sort of bringing some of these things that from different people, different places, different eras, and sort of bringing them to the forefront for us to be able to see and encounter, because the history's complicated, and that's okay. And I think I would rather us understand and walk through that and experience it, that complicated nature, as we try to understand it and make our world going forward.
Great. So that's a perfect transition. So we're now going to see some slides from the exhibit, The Age of Roe, the Past, Present, and Future of Abortion in America. After the slideshow, we're going to move to audience Q&A. So you can still submit questions through the Q&A function, and we'll look forward to answering them on the other side. Great. So thank you for your questions so far. A couple of the people asking questions wanted to hear a little bit more about a comparative perspective. So, for example, there have been lots of transitions in a lot of countries across the world that have both expanded access to abortion and in some instances contracted it. So some of the people were curious about whether Dobbs seems to have or will likely have a discernible effect on conversations about abortion in other jurisdictions. And I think relatedly, whether Dobbs will have an influence on kind of American soft power at large, right? Whether our constitutional norms or our Supreme Court's decisions are influencing countries outside of our borders. So if either of you have thoughts on that, that would be great.
This is far from my expertise. I will say that it does seem to be showing up, and especially immediately after, in some discussions in other countries, other places, and so my guess is that it will be a point that gets brought up, I would say, in these discussions in sort of the different countries and sort of global discussions, because it's easy to have these accesses, and because I think a lot of the framing of some of that discussion was connected to American politics in some ways. Though I don't know, I don't want to oversell that. I think it's interesting that you have, especially a lot of European countries had perhaps even somewhat more restrictive abortion laws than we had in America at sort of post Roe and Casey, though we were moving in different trajectories, you might say, right? America sort of becoming more restrictive, and in Europe broadly, I would say, becoming expanding choice rights. And so, those sort of moving in opposite directions as far as is something that I think is interesting, and I think we'll see how that plays out going forward. So my guess I'd love to hear what Kim had to say, but I would say we'll have some of these conversations, but I don't know how. I'd be curious on how much impact they'll have.
Yeah, I think Dobbs will be used in the way that any particular person wants to use it, right? So if you're in a country that is liberalizing your abortion laws, you say, we don't want to go backwards like the United States. And if you're in a country that wants to restrict abortion more, you say, we need to do what the US is doing. They're leaders here, right? So I think that's where we're going to see it, play out in the future.
Great. So one of the questioners asked about the role of science, right? Could arguments based on scientific evidence move the debate in a post-Dobbs era? If not, why not? But we hadn't really focused on that. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that question.
This is one of the things that I find most frustrating in the discussions that we have about abortion in this country, that the narrative in a lot of ways has been, dictated by folks who make up their own science, right? So we have heartbeat bills that are focusing on, making abortion illegal at a time when there isn't even a heartbeat. We have people testifying in front of Congress that terminating an ectopic pregnancy isn't an abortion. So I don't think that we are as much of a pro-science society as I would like to see. And so I don't think that it really makes much difference to a lot of people. And quite frankly, I think, if you are a person who fundamentally believes that a fetus at 6 weeks gestation is no different from a 6-year-old, it's not going to matter to you if I show you a picture, right? Or tell you what anatomy is not there at 6 weeks, because for you, it's not fundamentally about that piece of it. So I don't think science really takes us very far at all, unfortunately.
I'll just say I think that especially things like ultrasound machines and those kind of things played an important and sometimes overlooked role in the way that sort of the post-Roe world developed. And so I guess it's possible to have some other sorts of things that might draw people's attention in new and different ways. And so, but I think you are correct that there are sort of these science and scientific discussions are getting used in different ways by different parties, right? And so people are capturing their own vision of what the science says, and so that that happens in this issue. It happens in a whole host of other issues, but it's quite prominent, I think, among activists in this area. So it's possible. I mean, there are a lot of people who are somewhere in the middle, and so it is possible that some sort of scientific advancements would change the conversations or the people's values or opinions on these sorts of things. But you know, I haven't seen it happening I haven't seen it happening at the moment.
Great. And there were a couple of questions about the voices or other stories we could tell. One, and I can answer this because I know what voices were included in some of the letters in the exhibit. So one questioner asked, do we have stories from people who wrote to doctors or others about negative experiences about abortion? Do we have stories from people who have not experienced abortion but had negative experiences with pregnancy? And while obviously we don't have a universally representative set of letters, we do have stories of both of those kinds in the exhibit, because people wrote to doctors and to magazines and others with a really striking variety of stories about pregnancy and abortion, positive and negative, people who were seeking it out, people who had experienced it. And we were hoping as much as we could to let those stories speak for themselves. So I think if you go to the exhibit, you'll see that there isn't just sort of one narrative about what abortion means that you'll hear. Another, I think we have time for one more question. Another question, or kind of series of questions, asks, I would say, about how we think of the players in this debate, right? So what it means, for example, to be pro-life or anti-abortion, that being identified with religion. Conversely, whether arguments for choice or rights, how those came to be, how we began to think of abortion as a criminal matter rather than a constitutional matter. So if you have any, we only have a minute, so this will be very much a lightning round. If either of you have thoughts on which of those identities, if any, you expect to change in the Dobbs era?
Identities are an interesting thing. In fact, some of the data seems to suggest that when you would ask people what their identities were, they would choose both. Like there were substantial amounts of people that would choose that they were both, you know, pro-life and pro-choice, and that these identities in some sense didn't fit. And so there's been a series of some scholarship that has tried to do more qualitative interviews with people to try to understand like these sort of and I think Trisha Bruce has led some of those discussions, like where people fit in these spaces. And I think all that is really important to understand, and things that we can't capture perhaps on surveys, and we don't capture in just looking at the political advocates. You know, there are secular anti-abortion advocates, though numbers aren't as big, but they do exist, and so I certainly expect that these things will change people's identities, because if you're on the edge but you don't like, you know, the push towards absolutism and no non-exceptions, then your identity will probably change. How long? How sticky will that be? How much will that? I don't know. But we know people change their partisan identities based on, you know, what their evaluation of a certain candidate, and so I think that might happen.
Yeah, and the only thing that I'll add, because I know we need to wind down, you know, I think one of the really deep problems with the way that we talk about abortion in this country, as Andy suggests, is that it is so, you know, we act like there are these just two different poles, and yet people are deeply, deeply complicated, and this is an issue that is very personal for lots of folks. So I promise you, you will not find an abortion provider who won't tell you a story about somebody who was protesting in front of their clinic for months and months and months and years until the day that they came in to have an abortion or bring their daughter in for an abortion. And certainly you will find people who were deeply pro-choice until they became pregnant, and then that made them sort of feel differently. So, I think that if we can get to a point where we allow these conversations to be as nuanced and layered as they should be, that will actually allow people to not be in these, distinct identities, but to be people who simply care and who are compassionate and figure out where that takes us.
Great. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Jane Kaminsky back to the virtual floor to deliver some closing remarks.
Thanks, Mary. I want to thank you and Kim and Andy for this amazingly thoughtful conversation. Mary, again, for curating such a wonderful and layered exhibition, which I hope you will all visit in person, or if you must, online. And I want to thank our audience as well for a terrific set of questions. Registration to visit the Age of Roe exhibition is now open and can be accessed through the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu. It's free and open to the public through March of 2023, Mondays to Fridays from 9 a.m. until 4:30. Advanced registration is encouraged but not required. You can also, as I mentioned, view representative digital images from the exhibition on the website. I hope you'll also return to the Radcliffe website in early January when we'll open registration for our international conference, also entitled The Age of Roe, the Past, Present, and Future of Abortion in America, which will be held January 26th and 27th, 2023. Finally, today's program has been recorded, and the recording will be posted and captioned in about a week. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists for a wonderful model exemplary discussion, and do take care.